weekend.
That's right.
So it's good stuff after COVID to get back in gear.
Well, I really appreciate you guys coming. Good to see you all. So we are continuing our discussion about David here in a minute and moving on. But just a couple of key dates. Next week, no class. No class. They're having it's the first Sunday of Lent, and so there's like a church-wide annual meeting during the 10:15. So go ahead and if you want to come, plan on doing that. And then I'm going to be out of town on the 15th, so I'll send out a notice, and let everybody know. But just so you know, there's a couple weeks, and then 2 weeks, and then Easter comes on April 5th, so we won't have class on Easter. And then what I thought we would do is try to finish up. We've been talking about the Old Testament, in the history, which there's tons to talk about. But I kind of want to speed up and do kind of a Lenten thing because we're getting close to Jesus in the New Testament. So we'll do like a kind of a special Lent study and talk about the crucifixion and that kind of stuff. And then we can come back and towards the end of the class if there's some things that you guys would like to discuss. Hey, good morning. Good morning. How y'all doing? Good. So as we discussed last week, the stories that are in the Bible about David are likely, there's historical kernels in there, there's historical truths, but the way it's written is very much trying to drive home the fact that David, even though he most likely usurped the crown, held an insurrection, took over from Saul, kicked Saul out, but remained, his dynasty remained in power in Judah for the next 400 or 500 years. So from the Israelite point of view, he was the guy. So they needed to go back and beef up, clean up his reputation. And so we saw that in the stories. If you go to Chronicles, we're not going to talk a lot about Chronicles, but that after the Babylonian exile and everybody starts coming back, they kind of rewrite the history again, reinterpret their history. So Chronicles is a reinterpretation of the history. And in that story, everybody looks great. And David he's a choir boy. He spends all his time writing hymns and drawing up plans for the temple. And he's just this super nice guy that you just want to hang out and have coffee with, and not the David that we see when we kind of read between the lines. There's not a lot of historical. We got some historical stuff to talk about today, but I would feel remiss if I didn't give you at least the background, if you're not familiar with the David story, that after David becomes the king, what all happens. So after he becomes the king, and if you remember, he was at Hebron, which is just south of where Jerusalem is, and all the elders came and said, dude, we want you to be the king. He's like, sure, I'd be happy to be the king. So, but he needed a more defensible and strategic capital. So in the 10th century, and during David's time, Jerusalem was a Canaanite city-state. It had been inhabited by the Jebusites for many centuries prior to David. But it's strategically located up on a high ground, and it's a fortress city, and it's very defensible. So David's like, this is a good place to have the capital. So he goes, and I found this stuff online, and just I like maps and stuff like this. So this is a topographic relief map of Jerusalem. This is the Temple Mount. And then this is where the old city is. So you can see, and then these are the three, the Valley of Hinnom, the Kidron Valley, and then another valley, I'm not sure about this one, Tyrophian Valley. So all the drainage kind of comes down around the city. So there's water, it's up on the cliffs, it makes it very strategic. And so you always read in the stories everybody goes up to Jerusalem. Have you ever noticed that when you read the Old Testament and the New Testament? We're going up to Jerusalem. We're going up to Jerusalem. Even if they're in the story of Mary and Joseph taking baby Jesus, not baby Jesus, but teenage Jesus to Jerusalem. They're going up to Jerusalem even though they're in the north coming south. And it's because, good morning, because you had to go up. You had to climb up the road into the city.
What part of, now we know Israel, but if you were looking at that on a world map, what part of the world would that be in exactly? Like, would it be like close to Iraq or?
Yes,
like
I actually have a map in a
Jordan?
couple of slides.
Okay.
So
I'm a geography teacher, so
it's
I love all that
it's
stuff.
it's right. It's just it's right on the Mediterranean. So there's Egypt, and then the Mediterranean kind of curves up. Iraq is over to the east. Iraq and Iran are over to the east. Syria, Lebanon and Syria and Turkey are up to the north. So we'll see it a little bit on the map shortly. Okay, so David captures the city, makes a great fortress. The other thing he does before we get to David and Bathsheba is he brings the Ark of the Covenant from where it historically had been during the days of the judges and puts it in the city. And what that does is it connects his power with Yahweh's power, and the idea being, I get all of my power and authority from God. And clearly it worked, because the story, as we have it in the Bible, is written that David was the one chosen by God. So, and then we get to the famous story of David and Bathsheba. I'm sure you guys all know this story. It's interesting from a historical standpoint. It's interesting that in a text where they are doing everything they can to make David look good, they include this story that makes him look terrible. So this must have been, most scholars think there is historicity with this, maybe not exactly how it's described, but that this was a big deal and potentially could have brought down his kingdom. Otherwise, because kind of what they see, the historians see, is if it's a minor issue, then just don't talk about it, and people won't. But if people are talking about it, and if you're telling a revised story of David, and they're like, yeah, but what about the time he married or took Bathsheba? That was terrible, and they have to deal with it. So Bathsheba was famously bathing on the roof. Most scholars don't think that this was like taking a bath. This was probably ritual bathing after you menstruate or do things. Your body becomes quote unquote unclean, spiritually unclean, and you have to go through the ritual purification before you go to the temple. That's probably what she was doing.
You don't hear that much in Christianity, as you do like in the Muslim religion, where they have to wash their hands
correct.
And take off their shoes and all that before they go in.
They and some other, there are some Syrian versions of Christianity where they still do that. They hang on to those old traditions, as in the Muslims, in the strict observance. For the most part, that's been lost. Even I would say for most of the Jewish, unless you're extremely conservative Jew, you're not going to be doing that same thing. It's a Jewish custom, right? It came out of that.
Are we supposed to note some kind of difference that it would make if she's taking just a regular bath or a ritual bath?
A ritual bath is probably less revealing. You're kind of more up there doing a bit of a ceremony and splashing, like when we baptize babies or things like that. That's kind of a ritual bath.
Would you have like attendants there with her? Or?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, that would be
Maybe.
more dangerous for them.
Yeah.
They were witnesses.
So David sees her. Was it a romance or was it a rape? I kind of lean more towards the second. That when the king, he sees her on the rooftop, says, "Who is that?" They say, "Oh, that's the wife of Uriah, your general, who's out fighting the wars for you." And he says, "Send her to me." And when the king tells you to do something, you don't really have a choice as to whether you do something or not. And so Bathsheba gets pregnant. David's like tries to cover it up. So he calls Uriah back from the front lines and says, Uriah, you deserve a nice relaxing weekend. You've been working really hard. Go home and see your wife. And Uriah, whatever David does, he will not go sleep with his wife. And David's like, come on, dude, what's up with you? You gotta take care of this, because if Uriah sleeps with her, then the baby can be hers and his, and he's off the hook. And ultimately Uriah won't do it. And so instead, David he goes back into his bag of tricks that has worked well with him so far, and he sends Uriah to the front lines of the battle so that he will, and he actually gives Uriah the letter to the general, or to his head general, telling them to put Uriah on the front lines, and gives it to Uriah to take back. So Uriah carries his own death sentence back to the general, cold-blooded, yes. And then famously gets killed. Then David is free to marry Bathsheba, and all is good, supposedly. He does marry her. And then the prophet Nathan comes out. This is one of the few times we hear about Nathan. Nathan is very famous because he comes to David and he says, listen, I got a problem. There was this poor man, he only had one sheep, and there was a rich man who had thousands of sheep, and the rich man took the poor man's sheep. What are you going to do? And David's like, that man needs to be put to death. And Nathan famously says, you are that man, and he accuses David. There's some question as to historicity. Again, if David is kind of the guy that we think he is.
Where was the internet when you needed it?
Yeah, right? If he was the kind of guy that we... Right.
Well, it gets it out.
If he was the guy who they thought he was when he did that, David probably just would have killed Nathan, honestly. But Bathsheba goes on to become the mother of Solomon, who is important, as we'll see here shortly. But the heir to the throne was his son Absalom, who David loved. And but there's all sorts of strife. Another one of David's sons, Abijah, goes and rapes his stepdaughter. So a stepbrother rapes a stepdaughter, Tamar, and Absalom is infuriated, and he goes to David, and David won't do anything about it. And so Absalom plots and waits 2 years to get his revenge, and then he kills Abijah. David gets upset with Absalom. He's like, you put me in this terrible position. Why did you do that? So Absalom continues to get frustrated until finally he leads a revolt against his father, drives David out of Jerusalem. And then, in an effort to show to Israel who is the true king, Absalom has David's concubines brought out into the palace where he rapes them in public, so that everybody knows that he's the one sleeping with the concubines, because whoever sleeps with the royal wives is the one who is the king. So if Absalom's doing it, and we saw that most likely is what David did with Saul's wife, and why Saul was so intent on killing David. And this type of behavior is attested throughout that history from other cultures. Yeah. When you're ready, that's your show of power, that you're the one who can sleep with the royal wives.
Like the stallions taking over the herd.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've always wondered, what, in that culture, what should David have done to the son who raped Tamar? Because he didn't do anything.
Yeah.
What was he supposed to do?
There's all sorts of things as to whether it's, I think it's kind of equivalent to today, as somebody in power does something and then they don't get punished for it. They get off, they don't get charged. There was a trial, there's rules, and so something should have happened. They should have some sort of justice, whatever their justice is.
History repeats itself, which is not that we're supposed to learn from our history.
History, unfortunately, does repeat itself. So I think the problem was not so much that if whatever the penalty for that should have been, it was not administered. David just kind of whitewashed it over and was like, whatever. She's just a girl. Women at those times were property, not really valued very much other than for having children. Not a pleasant place to be if you're not a man. Not a pleasant place to be, honestly, if you're a man, but if you're a woman, it's even worse. So, and then Absalom, famously in the final climactic battle against David's forces, the Bible describes him as beautiful. He has long flowing hair, and as he's riding his horse into battle, his hair gets caught in the branches of a tree, and the horse takes off, and he's left hanging in the tree by his hair, and he gets killed. And that's the end of Absalom. And so that opens the door for Solomon to start to come in. So
all these brothers have different mothers?
they all have different mothers, yeah. So keeping track of the lineage as to who is what and where.
Yeah.
So at this point, Absalom's dead, a few other brothers are dead. So Adonai, or Adonijah, is the heir apparent. He's the oldest heir. And so he's like, I'm going to be king. My father is old. He's kind of on his deathbed. I'm going to be king. So it's not a revolt, but he just starts taking over some of these duties with the blessing of David, because David is, he can't do it anymore. He's he's on his deathbed, on his way out. And Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says, when Adonijah becomes the king, we're all dead, because he's going to take out anybody who could possibly lay a claim to the throne. And he said, and I stood up for you. Apparently David and Nathan and Bathsheba were, kind of connected. There was some kind of relation, I'm not saying sexual relationship, but some kind of power relationship. So Bathsheba goes to David and says, hey, honey, how you doing? It would be great if Solomon inherited the throne. He'd be such a better king than Adonijah. Nathan comes in, and then at the last minute, before David decides, yes, I'm going to give the throne and the crown to Solomon. So David calls Solomon in, and right before he dies, he gives Solomon advice, and his advice is basically, take out anybody who opposes you.
So where was Solomon in the family tree? Was he like middle, youngest?
Middle-ish. I don't know.
And you don't know why he was favored. Why was he favored over the other one?
This is the biblical text. I'm sure there was a lot of fighting and a lot of machinations as to who was grabbing the throne. And so they're all sons of David, so they all have a legit claim to the throne, and it's probably whoever came out on top, and was able to kill the other ones. So the 1 Kings chapter 2, David's giving advice to Solomon, and the first thing he says, keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and following his laws and his commandments and his rules and his admonitions. Further, you know what Joab did to me and what he did to Abner and Amasa. See that his white hair does not go down to Sheol in peace. So take out your rivals, but also take out Joab, because I never liked him, and he needs to be done. And he also, you must also deal with Shimei, the Benjaminite. There's this minor story as David's bringing the ark to Jerusalem, and Shimei says, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. The ark should be staying in Shiloh, where it was from. And he's like, he insulted me outrageously when I was on my way. You will know how to deal with him and send his gray hair down to Sheol covered in blood. So David, right as he dies, the last thing he wants to do is to take out all of his advice to Solomon, which Solomon does. And it reminds me, if you've ever seen The Godfather, there's the famous scene where Vito Corleone is passing everything on to Michael, and they're sitting in the garden having a nice chat. And if you watch the scene, it's about a 5-minute scene, but they talk about their kids and they talk about their grandkids, and he's so cute. And then Marlon Brando goes on and tells Al Pacino about all the people that he needs to take out and who he needs to kill, because if he doesn't, he won't survive and become the new Godfather. Very, very Godfather-ish in the Bible. Again, history kind of stays the same, tends to repeat itself.
But then why were they so anxious to have Jesus be related to them?
Well, this is us going back and reconstructing the story, but I think about, Thomas Jefferson. How do we think of Thomas Jefferson? A great leader. He expanded America, the author of the Constitution. He was a slave owner. He had illicit affairs. Racist. And he may have been a man. He was a man of his time for sure. So there's everybody, all of us, have our good points, and we all have our bad points. And we kind of choose, depending on how we conduct ourselves, our legacy will either emphasize maybe one over the other. So I think what they did is there was a concerted effort, especially as they were pulling the Bible together, to link the continuity with David. So by the time Jesus came along, it was the house of David. David's reputation was pretty intact. He was the one who gave authority, and he was the one to whom they trace back their lineage at that point. So it just, was he a good guy? And to your point, a man of their times, this is what everybody did. We see this all through other ancient cultures. So it's not like everybody else was being all noble. This was happening in Assyria. It was happening with the Hittites. It was happening in Babylon. The king gets ready to die, and there's a feeding frenzy and a power struggle as to who's going to come out on top. And whoever comes out on top ends up taking out all their rivals.
Well, the cavemen up until us.
Well, if you read English history, this is true all throughout English history.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's not just this played out throughout medieval and Europe, and even in through the Renaissance, and so then we get to, after eliminating all his rivals, Solomon begins to develop his kingdom. He's famous for marrying. He had 1,000 wives or 900 wives. I can't remember the number. Most of these were foreign wives. Most people think that if this is true, if this is a historical fact, well, one of the things we know people did in the ancient world, and again, even into modern world, is you get married to bring two rival factions together. You sign a peace treaty, you marry your daughter, two kings, you marry your daughter to the son. Now your two kingdoms are connected. It helps cement the peace treaty and whatever, so that you kind of take an opponent hopefully off the board as you're playing your political games. He was famously wise. The women came saying they couldn't decide who the baby was. Both of them were claiming, so Solomon, in his act of wisdom, says, just chop the baby in half and give half to each woman. And then the true mother says, no, don't do that. One woman is like, yeah, fine, that works for me. And the other woman is like, no, don't do that. That's terrible. Just give it to the other person. And then Solomon says, so this is the true mother. The true mother would look out for the health and well-being of the baby. No real proof that was a historical event. But those are the kind of things, that's how Solomon is remembered. And he is remembered for expanding and developing the Israelite kingdom throughout the entirety of Israel. And so what I want to look at, and here's a painting I found from Raphael, famously getting ready to chop the baby in half, although that looks like a pretty big baby to be having this argument about, but there you go. Well, there's the little one on the ground, and this one's about to get chopped up too over here. I don't know. I love art. Terry has educated me over the years to appreciate art.
Not the story.
Pardon?
The art itself, not the story that's shown in the art.
Well, I like all of it, yeah. And so Solomon begins his mission. He builds the temple. And so he brings in cedar trees from Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon, finished stones cut at the quarry, no rough-hewn stones, no noise in the house of the Lord while the temple's being built. And then you get to this last bit, and when Solomon had completed the construction of the house, he paneled the walls of the house with cedar, and then he covered everything with gold. The innermost part of the house, he fixed a shrine in which to place the Ark of the Covenant. He overlaid it with solid gold. He similarly overlaid the cedar altar, and then he overlaid all of the walls and all of the doors. So the way the Bible makes it sound, everything was covered in gold. And we do know that when Hezekiah was having to pay off the Assyrian king, a couple of centuries later, to try to keep him from invading and attacking Jerusalem, he stripped the temple of all its gold, including the front doors to the temple, which were covered in gold, and delivered it to Shalmaneser. So there's a couple of places where that has been defined. So there were it looked pretty good. So what I want to talk about now, we're going to move a little more into history. We've been talking about the story, and I just wanted to remind you, if you think about this line, this straight line arrow here coming through, this is what really happened, right? We may know some of what happened, but there was a course of events that actually happened in the ancient world. And then we have a story, and this story arc takes us back and forth and up and down, and at times it crosses over what actually happened, and we get a verse, or we get something that we can kind of go back and say, yeah, that kind of happened. But then there's other stuff, like when we get to here, and Saul goes and talks to the witch of Endor to bring Samuel up from Sheol to get advice. Highly unlikely that actually happened. So as we follow this story arc, though, through the Bible, what we start seeing is it gets closer and closer and closer to what really happened. And so by the time you get, whereas like in Genesis and Exodus, there's very little historical. There's a little bit of kind of the basic context seems about right, but there's not much historicity in the stories. By the time you get to the stories of Omri and Josiah and Hezekiah, therethat a lot of historicity that's being captured. And what that means is the scholars mostly say that most of the Bible was kind of compiled and written down during this time or shortly thereafter. So if you were to write a history of the United States, you'd have a lot of information about what happened in the 20th century. We could all sit down and brainstorm and come up, and maybe a little bit in the 19th century. And by the time you get back to the 1700s, we're only on a couple of key facts. And then maybe in the 1600s, it's a little murkier. The further you have to go back, the harder it is to be able to say exactly what happened. And so what people often, and what has happened in the Bible, and I think this is a key misunderstanding that a lot of people have, and I hope that what this class is helping us all to see, is the Bible is not history. The Bible is a theological history. It's someone writing down saying, this is how God is acting. This is our interpretation of who God is and how God has interacted with people in history. There's a definite slant to what's being written. And what's also interesting is in the Bible, depending on whether you're in the Psalms or the prophets or this Deuteronomic history, you get opposing views, because you have views in the Deuteronomistic history where it's totally acceptable and kind of expected that you would sacrifice children to Yahweh. And yet you have the prophets railing against child sacrifice. What, are you guys crazy? You shouldn't be doing that. So you have these two different views. Is it okay? Is it not okay? And you see that through a lot of these various stories. So just a little something, that there is this interesting historical core. It's for us to help understand. We just need to understand that what we're getting is not the actual true history. We're getting the interpretation of history from a theological point of view. Does that make sense-ish? All right, so as we talk about Solomon, so here's our map. Here's ancient Israel right on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. Egypt's down here. Saudi Arabia is here. Iraq and Iran are off to the east. Syria, Turkey, are off, Lebanon are up to the north. But, pardon? Phoenicia, yeah. I wanted to highlight 3 key cities. So when we start to talk about what can we historically know about Solomon, just like David, there's not much, but there is a little bit. And there's 3 cities: Gezer, here in the south of Israel, Megiddo up here, and Hatzor up in the north. These are all Israel, Kingdom of Israel cities, northern kingdom cities. And there's some very interesting excavations that occurred. So back in 1902, Stuart McAllister an Irish archaeologist, went down to Saudi Arabia to Israel, and started excavating the city of Gezer. That's the one to the south. And what he found was these massive, the foundations for a massive 6-chambered gate. I'll show you a picture of it in just a second. And he looked at that and he said, oh, this is clearly from the time of the Maccabees. The Maccabees is the time of Jewish independence right before the Romans came in and conquered, and in the time of Jesus. So about 100, 150 BCE is when the Maccabees were there. So he dates it to the 2nd century. And this is what this excavation looks like. And you can see these big stones and these little chambers where they could have come in and put massive wood doors. And what they would typically do is have this tower structure when you came into the city, and there's 3 levels of doors. And so he gets in here and he does this. But then in the 1950s, archaeologists, in the 60s, other archaeologists come in and say, no, there was a mistake in McAllister's dating. They go back through the data, they start to do more modern tests, and they date this to the 10th century, which is the late 900s. And they say that's the same time as Solomon. This could be evidence of Solomon's massive building across a unified kingdom. Yadin, who we talked about, Yigal Yadin, we talked about him earlier. He also did a lot of work in Hatzor, and William Dever, famous archaeologist. And so you see these gate structures. The picture kind of showed the ruins, but these foundations are laid. And so if you were to come into the city, you would come in through the gates. The walls would tie into the sides. And then there's these 6 chambers where you could have large doors, kind of like a castle, right? If you've seen, or Game of Thrones or something like that, they can close the big doors. And then if an enemy is attacking and they break through 1 or 2, there's a 3rd set. So it kind of offers multiple layers of protection.
That's what you meant by the layers of doors.
Correct,
Like
right.
Not
going up, but thick this way, yes. It's like going down this hallway. If you think about, did you ever see Get Smart? You remember Get Smart? And he walks through the hallway and all the doors are opening and closing in front of him, and then he has to go through like 10 different. sets of doors to get to the phone booth. It's kind of the same thing. If we were walking down this hallway, it's a long hallway to walk through, and then there are places where you could strategically put these thick wooden doors to keep people out.
It's nice to hear something that the kids don't.
Here's another picture, a little better picture of the gates from Hatzor. You can see the chambers clearly laid out here. And then Megiddo, you can see the chamber walls here. There's actually two sets. There's another set of gates here. And so what they're saying is, hey, this dates back to the time of Solomon. This kind of could prove that Solomon did rule over a united kingdom and had expanded it to the full extent, because all of these structures are all in Israel, not just in Judah. So, as I said, Yigal Yadin first noted the similarity in the construction of the gates, but he redated them to the 10th century. William Deaver, famously, very, very famous archaeologist in the 1950s, 1960s, early 70s, was dating things back to about the same time. So they supported this theory. So this theory kind of took over that, yeah, there's not a lot of history, but we have some evidence that Solomon had an empire that stretched across all of Israel. However, in 1994, Israel Finkelstein, he began excavations at Megiddo, and he started using more sophisticated tests. He went back and re-looked at the pottery shards. He re-looked at the radiocarbon dating, which wasn't available to the earlier archaeologists, and started saying, you know, I think these gates have been misclassified again, and that they're most likely 9th century, so 100 to 150 years later than where the earlier archaeologists said. This would take it out of, and so if we think about it, here's our timeline. Solomon lived here in the 10th century, but Finkelstein says these actually date to the 9th century, so 100 years later. And what does that mean? Does it mean that Solomon, there's no other evidence anywhere else of Solomon other than the Bible and potentially these gates? But there is this one king here, King Omri of the northern kingdom, who is mentioned in the Bible very quickly. He was a northern king, king of the northern kingdom, and the Bible has nothing good to say about any king from the north. So he gets about 10 or 12 verses, and he basically says he was an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. So, and that's not surprising because all of the kings of the north were abominations, and honestly, most of the kings of the south were also abominations in the eyes of the Lord, according to the biblical text.
Well, is that the north is the wrong side of the tracks or something?
Yes, yes. Well, and if you think about it, just remember, the north, when the Assyrians invaded, they wiped out the north, and you got refugees coming down to the south to get away from the Assyrian invasion. And then the Judea, the southern kingdom, survived the Assyrian invasion. The Assyrians left, and they were able to stay independent for about another 100 to 120 years before the Babylonians came and conquered them. What that did is cemented in their mind, in a time where you say if you get conquered by a country, it means that God is no longer with you and has allowed this other pagan horde to come in and capture your country and defeat you in battle. God is not with you. And so what the way the story then gets written is the northern kingdom were not following the commands of God. They weren't worshiping because they weren't coming to Jerusalem. In Judea, Jerusalem was the center of worship. You weren't coming to Judea to worship properly. That's why God allowed the Assyrians to obliterate your kingdom, and that's why. But we were worshiping properly in Judea, And that's why we survived. Today we would rewrite.
It was like a gradual decline. I know in another Bible study I did, that there was a gradual decline to where they had gotten so disobedient to God that God allowed, these armies to come in and just take everything, decimate them.
That is the theological story that is being told in the text of the Bible. Yes, that's what the story is. Did they really decline? I think what we can see is with Omri, he is actually the first king of either Judah or Israel that leaves a mark in non-biblical sources. We have Assyrian records that refer to the house of Omri, and that's and they also and that means that Omri had descendants who were interacting with the Assyrians long after he had left the throne. After Omri had died, his descendants continued to be players. The Moabites complain about military oppression from Omri. You're coming in, it's a town or a country kind of off to the side. He's a documented builder, which we'll go through a little bit. He acquired and fortified the city of Samaria, made it his capital. In all regions, Omri is an extremely successful king, even though the Bible says that he was wicked and disobedient and an abomination. And it appears that the northern kingdom, and maybe the southern kingdom as well, were major regional powers at a period of time. So I guess you could make the argument that theologically you would interpret events to say that because the northern kingdom wasn't worshiping properly, they had then wandered away, degraded, that God allowed them to be conquered, or it could just be they just got conquered. And history's being written by those who survive, right? The ones who, the victors and the survivors.
Back just digging things up and figuring out what really happened.
Exactly.
Astounding.
Yeah.
All of this.
And that's what's so striking about when we get to Omri and go forward, we have a lot of actual evidence of things. So the Mesha Stela, which is also known as the Moabite stone, I saw it this summer in the Louvre. It was really cool. And it was discovered in 1868 by an Anglican missionary. And it dates, and this was constructed up in Jordan, so near Israel. And it's a Canaanite inscription, but it closely parallels the story that's told in 1 Kings about a battle where Omri leads the northern kingdom into battle against the Moabites. And it has some details in the biblical story, and most of those details are corroborated in this independent source. And it also shows, because they were invading other countries, they were able to marshal a fairly significant army to go and invade and attack another neighboring country. They had kind of, by the mid-800s, become a pretty significant regional power. They were not on the same scale as Assyria and Babylon and Greece, Persia. They weren't these major global empires, but they were a pretty significant regional power. There is the Tel Dan stele, and we talked about this one because down at the bottom of this inscription is the only reference, or the earliest reference we have to the house of David. So that's why a lot of scholars say, hey, there's this one archaeological piece of evidence that names David. But the rest of the inscription all talk about Kings Jehoram and I had so much trouble with these Hebrew words. I wish they would get English names. It'd make life a lot easier. Yeah. Jehoram and Ahaziah. Both of those are direct descendants. They're the grandsons of, or the son and grandson of Omri. So we've got evidence that these kings were actually doing things regionally. We have a number of Assyrian monuments. We talked about the Kirk stele, or actually, I don't know if stele is singular or plural, like
How
sheep.
big is that in real life?
Tall, about my height maybe.
Oh, okay.
This one I think is a little taller. It's maybe 9 or 10 feet. It's the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser. Both of these are all in the British Museum. So when we do our class trip to London, we'll see all of that. But they talk many times, and all of these are just two examples. There's probably about 15 or 20 different steles that got discovered by John Taylor in the town of Kirk, and they have multiple descriptions of kings of Israel. The house of Omri is mentioned multiple times. And so what starts coming out from the archaeological record is that King Omri, who gets maybe 10 verses in the Bible, really seemed to have the footprint that gets ascribed to Solomon. We don't have any evidence of anything from Solomon, but we have tons and tons of evidence of King Omri. And then lastly, there's the whole capital of Samaria. They've done massive excavations in Samaria, first excavated in the early 1900s by Gottlieb Schumacher. And I like Gottlieb Schumacher because he was a civil engineer, so there's hope for me. I could be a famous archaeologist in my second career. And then in the 30s, Kathleen Kenyon, who we talked about several weeks ago, this was one of her first excavations. She came to be leading excavations by the 50s and was one of the first leading women archaeologists in Britain. But in her early work, she worked at the excavations of Samaria. And what they found were massive fortifications, a massive palace complex with different rooms, tile inlays on the floor, monumental architecture. And basically what they say is the study of Israel, that Samaria, it was a critical excavation because it not only gave us just a window into the past, but it showed us how Israel was living in the mid-800s and beyond. And it gives us specifically insight into the days of the Omride dynasty, or when King Omri had kind of put his dynasty together. So, what does this all mean? Most scholars today would say that Omri was actually the guy who did everything, captured all the land, pushed out the boundaries, built the fortifications, built the palaces. He and his dynasty are the ones who did all the heavy lifting, and that his accomplishments got lifted and put onto Solomon and David during the writing of the Hebrew Bible. And the reason for that is that at the end of the day, as we talked about earlier, Assyria took out the northern kingdom and destroyed them, and they were gone. But the southern kingdom survived, and so they said, hey, all these great things, that sounds like something Solomon would have done, because they're writing this history 300-400 years after Solomon, and they attribute to Solomon a lot of the things that archaeologists would say that were really results of King Omri.
Was there any possibility that Omri was son, grandson, collateral nephew of Solomon?
No. He came, there's no evidence. There's no evidence of that. The Bible doesn't seem to say that. The genealogies seem to be completely separate. The Bible says that they were separate lines. So I don't think that that's, and Omri actually came to the throne because he usurped the king who was there. He was kind of the model, like we were talking about David. He had an inside rebellion and insurrection and took over the kingdom. And then a coup, and similar to David, established a long-lived dynasty in the north. So there's a lot of parallels in these stories.
So what was the difference between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom and why?
So the story is, it's one of the stories I skipped over, which I probably shouldn't have, but I'm trying to go back to the map here. So after Solomon died, so according to the Bible, it was a unified kingdom, and everybody was together. And keep in mind that most scholars think that early unified kingdom under Saul, David, it's kind of a collection of tribes. You know, they were coming from a tribal way of living, and now they're kind of under a single form of government. So there's a little bit of pushback from some of that. And the story in the Bible is that after Solomon dies, Jeroboam is the kind of the head guy in the northern kingdom in Israel and represents politically in the court the northern territories, northern tribes. And Solomon's son Rehoboam takes over. And so Jeroboam comes to Rehoboam and says, listen, we all worked for your father, forced labor. He forced us to do the work. He was really driving us hard, and we built all of this stuff for your father. You should kind of ease up. A little break would be nice. You know, we've been paying lots of taxes. We've been giving a lot of labor. Just chill out. Give us a little bit of break, and we'll continue to serve you. Rehoboam goes back to his advisors. His advisors say, hey, that's actually wise counsel. I think you should do that to keep the kingdom together. But then Rehoboam goes out drinking with his buddies, and his buddies say, are you kidding? You're the king. You can do whatever you want. Why are you going to be easy on these people? Rehoboam comes back a few weeks later to meet with Jeroboam, and he says, you think my dad was bad? Wait till you see what I'm going to do. I'm going to double your taxes. I'm going to put even more labor. We're going to put the pedal to the metal, so to speak. And the northern kingdom says, screw that. If that's the case, we're not going to do that. So Jeroboam says, we're out. And there ensues a civil war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam for about 7 to 10 years that Rehoboam can't win. And so from that time forward, they kind of abandon the war, and there are two different kingdoms, the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. Now, the other thing that was different is that Jeroboam was like, well, listen, I can't send all my people down to the southern kingdom, to Jerusalem to worship. That's ridiculous. I'm not giving all my money to that guy. And so he sets up 2 shrines, one at Bethel and one at Dan, and he builds these big golden calves. And he says, which is a common symbol in ancient society of fertility, of a divine image, of who, you know, a place where God, and both of these places are mentioned in the Old Testament. Bethel is where Jacob famously, can't remember if he had the dream there or if he wrestled God there, one of the two. And then Dan also has some spiritual significance from the Old Testament. And so Jeroboam says, we're going to go worship here. You can go, Israel, you can go to Bethel, you can go to Dan, you can do your sacrifices, you can worship Yahweh there. You don't have to go to Jerusalem. And the southern kingdom is like, that's heresy. That's ridiculous. You have to come to Jerusalem to worship because that's where the temple is, and that's where the ark is, and that's where God lives. And so that became the religious divide, but there was a political divide over forced labor. Many scholars wonder whether the whole story of David and Solomon ruling over a united kingdom, a truly united kingdom, is actually true. It may have been a united kingdom for a period of time, just because maybe David held it in an iron grip, or there was some geopolitical things going on that they needed to be kind of consolidated together for a while, but they were never, you know, it wasn't a true nation where you had a succession of Israel. It was just kind of like, listen, the war's over and we won. Thanks a lot. We're going back to our own ways now. hard to say exactly how it went down, but that's kind of the general thought.
And the wars continue?
The wars continue until this very day.
I was gonna say, is it like the division of the Israelites and the Palestinians? Similar, because I know, Abraham, was it Abraham that had
Yeah.
two different sons, and one
It-
led into the Palestinian dynasty and the other led into Israel?
It's more of they were all Jews. They were all Israelites.
Yeah.
So they all kind of came, Israel seemed to form kind of as a collection of former Canaanites, former escaped slaves. They were kind of a diverse, maybe a little bit of a melting pot, in that kind of world. They weren't Egyptians per se. They weren't Syrians per se. They weren't, they were kind of like, as the Canaanite society collapsed around them, they kind of became their own group. And then the division between North and South was basically territorial. It was like, this is our southern regions, this is our northern. Because once you get below, say, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, Lachish, everything to the south is pretty much desert. You're moving into the Sinai Desert on your way, unless you're right along the coast, which is Philistine territory. So Judah was not the prosperous, the northern part is where everybody lives, right? It's kind of like Canada. Everybody lives in the south, and all the north is just empty Arctic tundra and cold. It's kind of the reverse. This is all kind of desert to the south. All of the fertile land is up here to the north. So the northern kingdom had most of all of the resources. They had the majority of the people. They had the majority of the land. I mean, they were the dominant force. And again, back to the point that when the Assyrians came and they basically destroyed Samaria, they destroyed and took into exile all of these people, and the only people left, the people from the north escaped down to the south, and because Jerusalem was not conquered during that invasion and survived, the southern kingdom survived for another 150 years, that put the mindset that what we were saying all along is right. They weren't worshiping God properly. They weren't doing things properly.
You said the golden statues.
Right, the golden calves, that's an abomination.
Yeah.
But is it really an abomination, or was it just two different ways of worshiping? It was certainly interpreted by the surviving Judahites as an abomination, but it may have just been that they were unlucky. And why did the Assyrians leave? They besieged Jerusalem for over 2 years, according to both the Bible and Assyrian records. And then the Assyrian records say that they had other military priorities in the kingdom, and so they kind of they said, we got everything we needed out of them. We got all their gold. We showed them who was boss, and we pulled back. And they agreed, which this is also recorded in the Bible, to continue to pay tribute to Assyria. So they pulled back. The Bible says that Yahweh afflicted the Assyrian camp with it, and then they left. They woke up in the morning and everybody was gone. So both sources are a little prone to exaggeration. So the truth is maybe somewhere in the middle. But at the end of the day, the southern kingdom continued to pay money and taxes and tribute to Assyria, continued to agree until they said, we're not going to do that anymore. And then, when the change came and the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, that's when the Judahites said, we're not going to pay our tribute anymore. And that's when the Babylonians came in and took them out, took the southern kingdom out. So I think it's all in the perspective. I mean, I think that's why it's so important to understand the bigger picture of the archaeology and the bigger timeline, that this is not what the story that's given to us in the Bible wasn't. They didn't start writing at Genesis and flow the story flows chronologically, but the writing did not. All that writing took place at a couple of key sections of times, collected a bunch of oral traditions and a lot of local mythology and fashioned it into a theological narrative as interpreted by the survivors of the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. So there's a definite slant as to how you see things. And then, like I said, when you get into the prophets, those are independent sources. Those were being recorded separately. And sometimes you see consistency, but other times you see wildly different opinions. The prophets rail against the Southern Kingdom, all the kings. It's not that you're not worshiping properly, you're not taking care of the poor, you're abusing the people, you're collecting all this wealth at the top and enriching yourselves while everybody else in the country is starving. You're offering child sacrifices, which is ridiculous. God never would require anything as horrible as that.
That just strikes me strange when you said that. I've never thought about that before. What you said about child sacrifices, that's exactly what God did when he sent his son Jesus.
It's certainly got, and when we get to Jesus in a few weeks, we're going to talk a lot about that. That's one interpretation. That's the traditional Christian interpretation of what Jesus did. I would argue that there was a variety in the early church, a variety of opinions as to what God was doing through Jesus. Yeah. But certainly after Constantine and kind of the narrowing down, that became the traditional Christian message, that Jesus was a sacrifice to God, from God, to appease God, or to appease the eternal justice in this, in the universe, so that people could be saved. But there is a lot of variant opinions on that that are not orthodox opinions, but there's a lot of different opinions as to how that played out. All right. Thank you guys so much for coming. Have a great week. No class next week. So I'll send out an email. No class next week, but I'll post the video and send out the slides, and then I'll see you the week after. Thank you.
Thank you.